Okay, we have some folks on here, so I'll just do a quick, a few housekeeping items here real quick. We are offering 1 hour of CEUs for LPCs, LMSWs, LCDCs, and LMFTs. And so if you want to claim that CEU, there is a sign-in link in the chat. So please go to the chat and click on that link to sign in. If you don't sign in, you will not be eligible to receive the CEUs. So it's really important if you want those CEUs that you have to sign in to start with. And then at the very end, I'll be posting a link for folks to do a short evaluation. And that evaluation must also be completed to receive your CEU for attending today. So with that, I'll do a quick introduction of Dr. Jason Robinson. He's a professor at MD Anderson's Department of Behavioral Science, and he's the director of its Behavioral Research and Treatment Center and a member of the Tobacco Research and Treatment Team there at MD Anderson Cancer Center. He has a PhD in clinical psychology from Purdue University and came to MD Anderson as a pre-doctoral fellow. Dr. Robinson has received numerous NIH grants and enjoys collaborating with other faculty interested in studying and treating tobacco use disorder. His research is focused on understanding the neurobehavioral consequence of nicotine dependence and withdrawal, and on using this information to develop novel smoking cessation interventions. In recent years, Dr. Robinson has become active in tobacco regulatory science research and its potential for shaping our nation's tobacco policies. Today, he's going to be presenting a very fascinating and interesting presentation and talking about the fast-moving and ever-changing landscape of emerging nicotine products, and that potentially threatens gains that we've seen in reducing tobacco use in the United States. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Robinson. And before I do, if you do have questions, please post your questions in the chat. Myself and Lady Jane will be monitoring the chats and keeping track of those, and we'll address those in about the last 10 or 15 minutes of the presentation. So thank you very much, Dr. Robinson. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bryce, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. Just first, I just want to briefly show you my financial disclosures. These are agencies that have funded my research over the years. Most of these are governmental organizations and a foundation, Duncan Family Institute. And in terms of the objectives of my talk, first I'm just going to talk about the state of combustible smokeless tobacco use in this country and remind everyone about their health risks. I'll then turn over and spend a bulk of my time talking about electronic cigarette products, their use, and potential risks associated with these products. I'll then next turn to a survey of some other emerging tobacco products, some of which are currently on our market, some of which are not, but are likely to be soon. And then throughout, I'll also be talking about recent and upcoming federal regulations that will be impacting tobacco products, some of which could substantially change the tobacco product landscape in this country in a major way. Just a reminder about smoking health risks. It's been known that 1/3 of cancers are attributable to cigarette smoking, and that at least 12 cancers are tobacco related. We know that smoking increases the risk of things like coronary heart disease, stroke, as well as oral cancers. Also things like dying from chronic obstructive lung diseases, and of course, lung cancer. And one thing I just want to mention about this slide is that this is just from cigarette smoking. Cigarette smoking by far is the driver of the disease risk and mortality. And as I'll show you later, it's certainly one of the most preventable causes of these things in this country. So why is this the case? Why are they so dangerous? Well, whenever you take a puff on a combustible cigarette, you are inhaling combusted cured tobacco leaf. In the act of burning an organic product like this, you're exposing yourself to several thousand chemical compounds, of which many dozens are known carcinogens, things such as benzene, acetone, formaldehyde, and tobacco-specific nitrosamines, for example. Why do people do this? Why are they exposing themselves to such risk? Well, it has to do with nicotine. Nicotine is a highly addictive, non-intoxicating psychostimulant with a very short half-life, around 45 minutes. You can contrast that with something like caffeine, which has a relatively long half-life of about 6 to 8 hours. So what does that mean? Somebody who smokes is going to have to smoke more frequently to obtain the nicotine and maintain sort of a steady state of nicotine in the brain. And like all other drugs of addiction, repeated exposure to nicotine actually alters the brain, and it alters the brain permanently. This is one thing that, of course, users never take into account. But we know this is the case because even people who quit decades later are still experience craving and are still at risk of relapse for the rest of their life. What happens then is once the brain's changed by nicotine, a user then begins to have to use the substance to avert nicotine withdrawal, which happens in the case of nicotine quite quickly because of its short half-life. Now, cigarettes are a very highly engineered product. Manufacturers have had over 100 years now to perfect them and to make them more palatable and addictive. And they've done this in a variety of ways. One, of course, is flavoring elements. Now, people don't realize this, but there are actually dozens of flavoring elements in a typical cigarette. These include things like sweet flavors, for example, but also things like menthol, which is actually a mild anesthetic, which makes it easier for the smoke to go down. They do things and add chemicals and treat the nicotine during its curing process in certain ways to alter the pH to make it more palatable. They also do things to the tobacco leaf to increase nicotine absorption by, for example, treating with ammonia during the curing process. And what that does is sort of one of the hallmarks of an addictive substances is the faster it gets to the brain, the more addictive it's going to be. And that is certainly the case with cigarettes, because inhaling something through your lungs is one of the quickest ways to get it to the brain. The good news is that prevalence of cigarette smoking has steadily decreased in this country. And really, I consider this one of our great public health victories, that is denormalizing smoking, where we went from 42% of the adult population smoking in the mid-60s down to less than 12% of adults smoking last year. And then similarly with youth, it went from an all-time high of 36% in the late 90s down to less than 2% as of last year. Now, of course, when I get to talking about electronic cigarettes, it's not all victory, because a lot of these youth have turned to these products like the electronic cigarettes. But really, considering this is the most risky form of tobacco use out there, we've really come a long way in sort of combating this scourge. Now, this slide is a little old. It's from 2016, but actually the messaging is still the same, and that is, besides dietary risk, tobacco kills more than any other preventable causes. So tobacco use to this day still remains the second leading preventable cause of death and disease in this country, despite the fact that we've seen such a decrease. Why is that? Well, a lot of the disease risk takes years or decades to manifest from smoking, and that's why we're still seeing it. And hopefully in the future, this number will continue to go down. So what about smokeless or chewing tobacco? Well, the prevalence of that's been pretty flat since surveillance began in the 90s, the early 90s. As you can see, it's been certainly far less than 5% of the population have been users of this. Primary users tend to be rural men. In 2020, the adult prevalence was 2.3%, of which 4.5% of those were men and only 0.3% of those were women. And in terms of 2022, the youth prevalence had gone down from 4.8% 2019 to 1.6% in 2022. Now, despite not combusting the leaf and exposing the user to thousands of chemicals, there is still a substantial cancer risk associated with those who are even just exclusive smokeless tobacco users, and that is cancers of the oral cavity, where you have your risk is 1.81. Why is that? Well, even when you have that, you're still exposing your oral cavity tissues to known carcinogens that are leaching out from the leaf. These include tobacco-specific nitrosamines and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Now I'm going to turn the bulk of my talk to talk about some of these emerging nicotine products, such as electronic cigarettes. I'll talk a little bit about synthetic nicotine products, some new smokeless and dissolvable products like snus or Zyn, and then heated tobacco products. So if anyone's heard anything about vaping in this country, it's really centered around the youth vaping epidemic. In 2019, it's seen in that green box there, 27.5% of high schoolers reported vaping at least once in the past 30 days. So think about that. Almost 1/3 of high schoolers admitted to interviewers that they had actually used an e-cigarette in the last 30 days. So an incredibly high number, almost as high as sort of the heyday of smoking back in the late 90s for high schoolers. And then with middle schoolers, you can see the numbers are lower, but we still saw that spike in 2019 where it was about 12.5%. So then what happens? 2020, the pandemic happens during 2020 and 2021. Kids are not in school. The numbers drop precipitously. Then in 2022, you can see the numbers sort of increase slightly for high schoolers. But then by 2023, the numbers just came out 2 weeks ago. They actually dropped again. So it's not clear what the long-term trend is going to be here. Is vaping going to return to what it's going to be? Is it going to drop some more? We don't know these things. Unfortunately, though, while the high school numbers dropped in 2023, they continue to slightly increase for middle schoolers relative to the all-time the low they had in 2021. And as you can see from this is 2023 data here that just came out. Electronic cigarettes considered to be the most are the most popular products among high school students by far, followed distantly by cigarettes, cigars, and then nicotine pouches like Zyn, and then smokeless tobacco. So you can see by far it's still electronic cigarettes. And why is that? Well, it's primarily the flavors. The kids really like the sweet flavors that you can find in electronic cigarettes that you really cannot find in any of these other products. This figure here is also a little bit out of date, but the data are still the same today. And that's basically showing that there's an inverse relationship between age and use of e-cigarettes. That is, the older you are, the less likely you are to be a user of e-cigarettes. E-cigarettes continue to be dominated by youth and young adult use in this country. Why is that the case? Well, many adults continue to believe that e-cigarettes are just as dangerous as combustible cigarettes. So what are electronic cigarettes exactly? Well, these are devices which vaporize a solution of propylene glycol, glycerol, nicotine, and flavoring. The key word here is vaporizing. So unlike cigarettes, which combust and burn, what this device does is it's actually heating up liquid. It produces an aerosol. You then breathe the aerosol in. And for the vast majority of users, most of that aerosol is deposited in the upper airways. Very little of it usually gets to the lungs, again, for most users. Things like propylene glycol and glycerol, these are FDA approved for consumption, these chemicals. They're found in things like ice cream, for example. However, they've never really been approved for inhalation. And then you see nicotine and then some flavoring that are also added to these liquids. These products entered the market only in 2006, so they're relatively new. And while they come in a variety of shapes and sizes, as you see in that figure there on the right, they all have basic elements that are the same. They have a battery to provide power that then heats, that then flows into the atomizer, which heats the liquid. The liquid which is held in the cartridge. So another thing you may be aware of when you talk about electronic cigarettes are Juul devices. So in 2017, a little known startup from San Francisco, so not a tobacco company, created this device. And within 3 years, by 2017, they had captured over 70% of the United States market. So they went from 0 to 70, up to 75% actually, within 3 years. Just completely came out of nowhere. So what was going on here? Well, they came up with a product that was pretty slick. It had a high nicotine content, a 5% solution, which is about 59 milligrams per milliliter. It was one among the highest. It's not the only one that high, but there's only a few products even to date that are that high, typically sold unless you blend your own e-juice. The chemist came up with a sort of a novel nicotine salt benzoic acid solution that basically made this really high nicotine content solution more palatable to users, especially among novice users, that is youth. They came out in a lot of flavors that were attractive to young people, like mango and other sweet flavors. The device is very easy to use. You just take the little pod, you plug it into the device and start puffing away. No buttons to be pushed. And when you charge it, you plug it into your USB charger. And it's obviously was easy to conceal. It looked like a USB drive. And finally, they had a very savvy social media presence on social media and whatnot. And in fact, if you've been following the news, they've now paid over $400 million to various states to settle claims that they were marketing this product directly to youth by the use of young-looking models. So where's Juul today? Well, in October 2019, Juul voluntarily suspended sales of flavors. They were the only company to do this, well, besides menthol, because they were getting a lot of flack in the media. They were getting a lot of pressure from activism. They were getting a lot of threats from Congress because, again, they were over 70% of the market. So they voluntarily said, you know what, we're not going to sell these flavors anymore because that's what kids like. And then June of last year, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, actually rejected their marketing authorization application. Juul immediately sued. The federal judge then put a stay on it and said they can still sell the product pending the outcome of litigation, and Juul is still on this market. And I'll talk more about this marketing authorization process later. But basically, as of last year, if you look on this pie chart to the right, Juul is still the single largest seller of legal e-cigarettes in this country. And I'll talk about what's going on with the illegal market here shortly. So Juul, so despite actually being rejected by the FDA, they're still being sold and they're still the best seller. So what about risks? Well, there's been obviously a lot of studies looking into these devices. One of the problems, of course, is that there have been literally thousands of these devices on the market, and as well as different flavorings. And so, but there's one thing that's been found, and that is they tend to vary in various potential toxicants. Well, some are things such as carbonyl compounds like formaldehyde, which are known carcinogens, tobacco-specific nitrosamines, again, known carcinogen, volatile organic compounds such as benzene, as well as particulate matter and metals like nickel that leach out of the atomizers in the tanks that users are potentially being exposed to. Again, it really depends on the device. These devices change all the time, so it's hard to nail down an exact number, exact risk associated, exactly how much are people being exposed to with each of these potential toxicants. Another thing you may remember from 2019, which seems so long a time ago, just before the pandemic here, was the e-cigarette or vaping product use associated lung injury, or EVALI crisis, 2019. So what happened was in summer of 2019, there was all of a sudden an epidemic of hospitalizations across our country. Over 2,700 hospitalizations and 60 deaths were attributed to EVALI, including 244 cases and 4 deaths in Texas. What was happening is people were showing up in the emergency room. In some cases, it looked like they had lipoid pneumonia. In some cases, it looked like they had chemical burns to the lungs. In some cases, people had to have lung transplants. So very severe lung injuries were showing up. The CDC began its weekly surveillance reports on it. But by February of 2020, they published their last one, and they basically concluded that vitamin E acetate added to THC vaping liquid is, quote, strongly linked to EVALI. So what was going on, it seems? Well, even in states where THC or recreational marijuana use is legal, THC vaping liquid is very expensive, over $5,000 a kilogram. And so what some unscrupulous vendors were doing was they were cutting it with vitamin E acetate, which is a common chemical found in skin creams, for example. It apparently looks and has sensory properties like the THC fluid, vaping liquid, but it turns out that it's very dangerous to the lungs. And so the word got out, and as you can see in the graph on the bottom, the numbers began to decrease. Now, they have not gone away completely. There's always people being hospitalized at a low level, relatively speaking, at least according to the literature. So we're not sure if that's the only thing that's been causing these sorts of things found in among vapors, but It seems to have been the driving cause of this EVALI crisis. So what about other e-cigarette health risks? Well, one, of course, is nicotine dependence. I talked about how things like Juul have very high levels, they deliver very high levels of nicotine. And even when you consider the fact that most of it's being absorbed slower in most users, because in most users, they're not inhaling it very deeply. It's getting to the upper airways. It's taking longer and to get to the brain. You're still, in the overall scheme of things, exposing to users to very high levels over time. And we know that youth are getting addicted to this substance, and that people develop symptoms of dependence. So that's the biggest issue. So basically, we've created a next generation of people dependent on nicotine, really since the late 20 teens here. What about respiratory diseases besides EVALI? Well, studies have been finding that among never smokers, those who currently use e-cigarettes are associated with greater odds of developing chronic bronchitis, emphysema, or COPD than among those who've never used e-cigarettes. So the important thing here is finding a sample of people who've never used cigarettes, because once you start finding people who use both, the effect of cigarettes is going to basically cloud all your results here. But now, since we're getting people now who are only exclusive e-cigarette users, we can actually more accurately identify the risk associated with just that product. We're also seeing signs that there is respiratory disease risk among youth. There's some evidence from some studies that e-cigarette use, again, exclusive e-cigarette use, is associated with chronic bronchitis and asthma in youth. People have also looked at inflammation. Inflammation is a driver of most disease processes, but it's been found, but at a lower level than smoking. But ultimately, and I want to emphasize this, is that the long-term effects of e-cigarette use are unknown. These products have just not been on the market long enough. With cigarettes, it takes years or decades, often for the health effects to manifest. This product's only been on here since 2006 and only really took off starting really about 2015 in this country. So we really don't know what the long-term effects are going to be. People often ask us in our clinic, what about, can I use e-cigarettes to quit smoking? And we know that people are doing it because they tell us they're doing it. And in fact, there's some evidence out there that e-cigarettes have now become the #1 way that people are attempting to quit smoking, more than, for example, nicotine patches, nicotine gum, or Chantix. So is it effective? Well, there have been some clinical trials that have found that e-cigarettes are effective for smoking cessation. But when you look at observational study data, which is sort of the larger body of research, the data are really inconclusive. So we're not really sure if it's really an effective way to help people quit smoking. That because of my third point there, and that is the promise is that many smokers who try e-cigarettes become, quote, dual users of both products. So they're smoking cigarettes and sometimes vaping at other times. The problem is we know that even if you cut back on your combustible cigarette consumption, even smoking a few cigarettes a day carries a substantial risk of cancer and heart and cardiovascular related diseases. So becoming a dual user is not helping a person. You potentially, if you switch all the way, it will. That is away from combustibles, but smoking both is still exposing you to the risks of combustible cigarettes. So I just want to introduce some federal regulatory activity that's been going on that's potentially going to have a big impact on e-cigarettes as well as cigarettes in this country. First off, I just want to, if you weren't aware, in 2009, Congress granted FDA authority over tobacco products for the first time. Prior to this, tobacco products were only regulated as an agricultural or trade product. So the tobacco companies could put whatever they wanted into it, and they did. They were basically self-regulating. However, in 2009, the FDA finally gave them the FDA authority. They actually can have authority over all aspects of the manufacture of these products, so what goes into them, as well as the marketing of these products. One stipulation, though, and this is important when I'll come back to it later, is that the FDA can reduce but not eliminate nicotine in tobacco. So that was explicitly written into that law. The question is how low could they potentially mandate nicotine levels to go? Because we know that from some of the research that we've been a part of, if you reduce nicotine low enough, it becomes non-habit forming or non-dependent forming. And presumably people have less reason to smoke or to start smoking. In December of 2019, another really momentous thing happened. Congress finally raised the minimum age of the sale of tobacco products, including e-cigarettes, from 18 to 21 years, so on par with alcohol sales. Why is that important? Well, 90% of users are those who become dependent on nicotine and tobacco products start before the age of 21. So if we can at least cause some of them to delay their exposure to these products, presumably they would become less likely to become dependent on them or use them, period. In September of 2020, the FDA's pre-market tobacco product applications were due for all new products that had been on the market since 2007, which included all the emerging products I'm talking here, including e-cigarettes. So what does that mean? If you wanted to keep your product on the market, you had to submit this application. While your application was being reviewed by the FDA, you can continue to sell your product legally in this country. Now, this is not just a simple matter of filling out some paperwork and sending it off to the FDA. This had to be an entire report, including toxicology. You had to have evidence your product was safe. Basically, the FDA itself said that each of these applications is going to cost at least $150,000 to produce. So you can imagine if you're a mom and pop vape shop and you're making 30 flavors and selling 30 flavors, you were supposed to have submitted 30 different applications. Now, obviously, if these things cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, that's not realistic. However, the FDA did receive or has received 26 million applications to date. Most of these, actually, I think 22 million were actually submitted late, but they're still reviewing them. And most of these applications were actually incomplete. They did not contain the toxicology reports and whatnot. And over 99% of them have been reviewed, and most of them have been rejected. And to date, the FDA has only granted marketing authorization for 23 tobacco-flavored e-cigarette products. That's it. Now, some of the more popular ones are still under review. Products such as Juul, I believe Juul is going to resubmit if they haven't already done so to try to get their product approved the second time around. So again, as long as they've submitted something, they can continue to sell. So, but 26 million applications, that just boggles the mind, because before that, even when we did surveys of these sorts of things, we could maybe count 14, 15,000 products. I don't know where the 26 million came from, to be honest. In April of last year, then the FDA announced a plan to ban menthol cigarettes and cigars. So this was a sort of a loophole they allowed, because in 2009, the first thing they did after they got regulatory authority by Congress was to ban flavored cigarettes, except for menthol. So this is sort of closing that loophole. And this is going to be substantial. This is going to, I mean, we're talking at least 45% of the population smokes menthol cigarettes. So it's going to be a pretty big thing. There's been some pushback because we know that menthol tends to be disproportionately popular in a lot of minority communities. So there's been pushback from that angle. Unfortunately, some of that's actually being paid for by the tobacco company to get people to go speak out against this. So it's interesting to see what's going to happen. This thing's supposed to come out any day now, but we've been waiting since April, so we'll see what happens. Illegal products. So I told you that anyone who wanted to continue on the market had to submit a PMTD, and they did get a lot. The problem is that a lot of these products that were banned were basically just repackaged and continue to be sold in this market. There was an interesting news article that came out from PBS NewsHour that I'm quoting here, basically that there are over 9,000 different illegal products available in the United States. The most popular being Elf Bar, which is basically a repackaged puff bar, which is a disposable Juul-like device that contains sweet flavors. And so it turns out that actually 40% of the market in this country, of the $7 billion market, is basically comprised of these illegal disposable devices. So 40%, think of 40% of the market is comprised of illegal e-cigarettes currently, or as of last year. And there's an interesting quote here in the bottom. Entrepreneurs can launch a new product by simply sending their logo and flavor requests to Chinese manufacturers who promise to deliver tens of thousands of devices within weeks. So what's going on is as soon as a product's being flagged as being illegal at port of entry, you just go, you have the same product, you just give it a different name, different packaging, and it's delivered to the United States within 6 weeks from Shenzhen, China, which is where almost all these products, legal or otherwise, are manufactured, and they continue to flood in. So there's been a lot of frustration about this sort of thing. The problem is that the FDA does not have its own enforcement authority. So anything that they want to have enforced, they have to put the case together. Then they have to go to the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice has to then decide to then follow up and prosecute whoever the FDA has identified is bringing in these illegal products. So they're basically all over the country, in these a lot of these vape shops. So now I'll turn to some other products that are on the market. Talk briefly about synthetic nicotine, just because there were some interesting things that happened here. In February 2020, the FDA had what's called a partial flavor ban. Again, this all became out in response to Juul. What was interesting, though, was Juul already had a voluntary flavor ban about 6 months before this, but they came out with this nonetheless. So basically, the FDA banned all e-cigarette flavors except for tobacco and menthol. However, they exempted disposable e-cigarettes and refillable tank systems. Again, why they did that, I've never heard an explanation as to why they exempted those two. So what happened? Users, mostly youth, turned to these disposable e-cigarettes to obtain flavors. At the time, puff bars was the big thing. Now it's elf bars. Once those things are blocked, it's going to be something else. Another tactic that manufacturers took is they began to sell products that contained only synthetic nicotine. So this is nicotine not extracted from tobacco leaf. And they argued that it was exempt from the FDA regulation. Well, apparently that was the case, because in March of 22, Congress granted the authority over synthetic nicotine products explicitly. And then in July of that year, the FDA ruled that synthetic products without marketing authorization had to be removed. So basically, they were given by Congress 2 months to review all applications. Again, they were given actually over 2 million PMTA applications just for synthetic products, and they were supposed to have done this within 2 months. They didn't do it within 2 months, but I think they've largely caught up and they're almost done, and they've rejected pretty much all of those products. So switch over to oral pouches. So snus is one that's on the market now. It came out a couple years, and you can get it in Texas, anywhere they sell tobacco products. Basically, it's an oral pouch that contains ground air cured tobacco. It's in those little packets. You place it between your upper lip and gum. It's so mild you don't even have to spit. Unlike most other products, this has been actually over 40 years of research on it from Scandinavia. This product, I think, is from Sweden originally. It's been around for, I don't know, at least 60 years. And in fact, in Scandinavia, at least a couple of countries, this product is more popular than combustible cigarettes. And there was actually research to show that it has reduced tobacco-specific nitrosamines compared to, for example, regular smokeless tobacco. So potentially less risk of developing oral cancers from it. In 2019, the FDA was apparently impressed enough by this that they granted marketing approval to snus under the brand name General. And not only that, but they actually granted approval as a modified risk tobacco product, or MRTP, the first product to be granted this designation. So what does that mean? Snus actually can put in their advertisements, whether it's at the store, online, print, whatever, that, quote, using General Snus instead of cigarettes puts you at a lower risk of mouth cancer, heart disease, lung cancer, stroke, emphysema, and chronic bronchitis. Now, as you can imagine, this MRTP classification has been controversial in the tobacco control field. But very few products, and I'll talk about the other one that's been granted this, very few products have been granted this approval at this point. There are also something called extracted nicotine products. So this is basically, there is no tobacco leaf whatsoever in this product. Basically, nicotine is extracted from it and chemically mixed with some artificial starches, sugars, things like that to make products. So for example, tobacco-derived nicotine pouches like Zyn is the most popular in that category. So they come, again, those little pouches that you put it between your lip your gum. There's things like dissolvable tobacco pellets, strips, and sticks, though the FDA, I think, has not approved any of those to date. I guess actually, I'll take that back. The only one they did approve was the Verve extracted nicotine chew and discs, actually in mint flavors. But strangely enough, once the FDA approved it, the manufacturer took it off the market, so it's not even being sold. You can't get a hold of it anywhere here. The final product I'll talk about is heated tobacco products. So these are electronic devices that heat treated tobacco leaf filters. So this is sort of a hybrid between a cigarette and an electronic cigarette. So if you look at the picture on the right, there's this little tube. It looks like a little short stubby cigarette that actually contains machine processed tobacco leaf that's been chemically treated to not combust. You stick it in the end of this little pen-like device, push the button. The device has a filament in there that heats it up, so it heats the tobacco, which releases sort of a vapor. You breathe it in, and it's not supposed to combust or burn the leaf at all. And then the box here is where you keep everything. It's got a charger in it, and you can keep a couple, 2 or 3 of the little cigarettes in there. In 2019, the FDA actually approved this for marketing in the United States. And then in 2020, they went further and actually granted it that MRTP, that modified risk tobacco product designation, so they can market it as being safer than cigarettes. It was only the second product to actually be granted that. One of the things, criticism about this product, though, was unlike snus, there's been very little non-industry sponsored research about it. So pretty much everything the FDA was going on was research that was generated by the manufacturer. And also, we don't know the long-term health effects of this, much like e-cigarettes, because it's just a new product. Now, if you want to go look for it, the problem is that it's been off the market here as of November 2021 due to a patent dispute. And I have no idea when that's going to be settled. I'm going to talk about harm reduction because the FDA can't ban all nicotine or tobacco-related products. So what they must do is they sort of have to consider harm reduction. What sort of products are going to minimize users' risk of disease? And so in 2017, Scott Gottlieb, the then head of FDA, and Mitch Zeller, the then head of the FDA Center for Tobacco Products, it had a commentary where they said, quote, rendering cigarettes minimally addictive or non-addictive within a landscape including other non-combustible products such as e-cigarettes represents a promising foundation for a comprehensive approach to tobacco harm reduction. So you can see right there, they're laying out a roadmap, and they're thinking that they're going to basically try to make combustible cigarettes non-addictive. Again, they can't ban them. And they're going to try to push people over to these non-combustible products, like e-cigarettes, that are presumably not exposing people to all those chemicals released during combustion. Well, we saw the sort of the fruition of that in June of last year. The FDA announced plans to, quote, develop a product standard that would set a maximum nicotine level in cigarettes and associated products. And basically, if you continue on this, it would basically make those products minimally or non-addictive. So, I mean, this is a complete game changer, because if they take this to the logical level and reduce nicotine to a low enough level, cigarettes will no longer be dependence forming. And presumably most people will have no reason to smoke these or to get dependent in the first place. And think of all that potential death and disease we would avoid if that were the case. Again, we've been waiting since a while for this one. I have no idea if and when the FDA is actually going to have a final ruling on this. But at this point, I'm going to say 2024. So some of the outstanding questions here. One is, of course, I've mentioned this before, is we don't know the long-term health effects of these products because they're all too new. Presumably, they're going to be less risky than combustible cigarettes because they don't involve combustion, but we don't know that because things, for example, with e-cigarettes, you're still breathing in this vapor that may actually be damaging the lungs, for example. Youth use. What's the future of youth use? And are things like e-cigarettes going to become a gateway to smoking? The reason why I say that is because, again, most people who vape don't breathe it in. The particles aren't small enough really to really penetrate the lungs that well anyways, compared to combustible cigarettes. Combustible cigarettes have what's called a superior pharmacokinetic profile, in that the particles are so small, people tend to breathe them in deeply into the lungs. They get absorbed very quickly into the arterial bloodstream. They get to the brain very quickly. And so in that sense, it's a much more potent way to maintain an addiction. So all these people who've gotten out dependent on electronic cigarettes going to switch to it? Now, so far, we don't see the evidence of it, because if you see the cigarette rates keep dropping, but is that going to continue as those people become adults? We don't know. Secondhand vapor exposure risk, we don't know what's going to happen. We know a lot about secondhand smoking risks, but we don't know really anything about secondhand vapor exposure. What is the role of these products in smoking cessation? Again, some of the clinical trials have shown it to be the case, but others, sort of the surveillance trials, have not. One of the problems here is we cannot actually do this research in the United States. It's a long, complicated story why we cannot, but basically we'd have to have a manufacturer who agreed to submit what's called a master file to the FDA CDER branch, which is in control of all medicinal products in this country, and agree to a joint venture with a researcher to study it, but none of them done so far. What about these FDA cigarette nicotine standards? What's going to happen? Is the FDA going to actually propose a standard that is low enough to break that the nicotine's hold on the brain? We don't know. What's going to happen with the courts? Because as you can imagine, when the FDA proposes anything and actually enacts it, they're sued by multiple people. Will smokers switch to these non-combustible products? So even if the nicotine starts to make, the FDA starts to make combustible cigarettes less appealing to smokers by reducing the nicotine, are they going to actually switch to these products, or is there going to just be some giant black market thing like we saw with the prohibition of alcohol in this country in the 20s and 30s? And then finally, enforcement of these regulations. As you can see now, enforcement is woefully lacking. 40% of the products in the United States being sold are illegal. What's going to happen in the future? And I'll just end with a couple of resources. People often ask me about help for youth wanting to quit vaping. Unfortunately, we don't have any studies, cessation studies here currently for youth. What we do is some of our colleagues, though, are involved in this Truth Initiative. This is quitting campaign. This is actually a text-based quitting campaign that youth can enroll in. All they have to do is text Ditch Vape to 88709 to get started and to help them quit vaping. At MD Anderson, we do offer a lot of remote trials to people across the state of Texas. So if you know smokers who want to quit smoking, for example, send them to Nicotine-Study.com. If you have smokers who are not necessarily ready to quit, but are interested in trying e-cigarettes, we have switching studies we're doing for the NIH and the FDA, also at Nicotine-Study.com. It's easy to go to. You'll go to this website, and the first thing you see on that, first it sends you to an MD Anderson page, but it'll say automatically, I'm ready to quit or I'm not ready to quit. And then you just pick that, and from there, we can assess people to see which study would best fit them. Again, all these studies is free. People actually get reimbursed to be in these studies. And that is it. So yes, questions. See a bunch in chat.
Let me unmute myself. Yes, so we have a couple questions, and one question, Dr. Robinson, gonna kind of go back to the one of the first couple slides. Question is, this attendee says, I thought that tobacco use was the #1 cause of preventable death and disability, and you noted dietary choices to be #1 and tobacco use being #2. And the person wrote, I just want to make sure I understand that correctly.
Well, yeah. I think it depends on the study. I've actually seen both ways. Mm-hmm. But I think dietary choices combined with obesity, combined with lack of exercise, I think if you put all those together, that's #1. That's my understanding of it. and tobacco is a close number 2. So it depends, but I think the trajectory we're at this point is that tobacco is going to continue to slowly drop over time.
Mhm.
It's going to be 2, I think, for another decade or 2 probably, but it's going to continue to drop.
Yeah. Another person asked, and you kind of touched on this in the very last slide, but once a person stopped vaping, what are the long-term damages, and how long may those damages last through a person's recovery?
You're talking about, well, we don't know that actually. There's been certainly, and the people who are being studied the most are the people who had this EVALI syndrome with severe lung injury. And in that case, those people who've had that, I mean, the rest of their life, their lungs are never going to recover to where they were. In terms of people who are not having that level of problems, but maybe developing asthma sort of symptoms, we don't know that yet either, because it's sort of a new thing. Surveillance is just really starting. We've got some really big studies funded by, for example, by NIDA, that are following lots of people over years. So we have a longitudinal study. So we'll hopefully get a better idea of how these diseases progress. But I can't answer those questions. And in the one I do know, of course, is what nicotine does to the brain. Again, those changes are the brain are permanent. You can lessen them, but your brain will always be sensitized to nicotine in the sort of environmental stimuli associated with smoking, right? So if you're a person who smoked while you're getting your car and you quit, anytime you're getting your car, you're going to think about cigarettes for quite a long time, and it could come back even if you hadn't had that thought for a while. So we know those changes really never go away. They just sort of slowly fade, but become less bothersome.
Mm-hmm. All right, very good. This is kind of a two-part question. Let's see. So I expect that there is current research comparing the impact of electronic cigarettes / vapes to traditional tobacco with regards to long-term health risks, but I imagine it'll take a while. Any idea when initial results may be expected? So comparing vape products to, and I'm assuming kind of traditional combustible cigarettes.
Yes, the issue is I referred to some like NIDA sponsored long-term longitudinal data. That data is only going to follow people. Let's see, I mean, 14 years or something like that. So even that might not be long enough. Mm-hmm. And so it's not clear to me when we're going to have definitive proof. There's not going to be some sort of one study that's going to provide a definitive proof. And that's it's the difference between now and if you think back at combustible cigarettes, it took unfortunately decades before even the first researcher there's an interesting book on that history. It's called The Golden Holocaust. Talks about this, that it basically took, I mean, really probably 30-40 years before you saw one lone researcher, I think from Brazil, started saying, this is a health risk. This was, by 1930, and the product had already been in the market for 30-40 years. Mm-hmm. That's not going to happen here. Obviously, we're much more savvy to this. There's a lot more people looking into this question. It's not going to take 30-40 years to figure this out, I don't think. But when it's going to be exactly, I don't know. And there are studies going on. It's just, the problem is it's very hard to do long-term surveillance studies. They're very expensive. There are not a lot of them out there, and most of them don't last potentially the decades we would like, and they would last a few years, or 10-15 years at most.
Right on. All right. And then the second part of that question, and often we hear people say that vaping is healthier, quote unquote, healthier than traditional tobacco or cigarettes, and we don't really know the risks. So what do we currently know that we can combat this mindset? So if someone does say that, what could we come back and say?
Well, the first thing you always want to correct people and say, first of all, I would never say something's healthier than the other. I would say, as far as we know, other products are less risky than combustible, because there is a continuum of risk. that we know from, your odds of developing cancer or cardiovascular disease. So you can legitimately say that certain products are less risky than combustible cigarettes. You can never say they're healthier. I would never use that term. I would always use it less risk. The problem is that there's a lot we just don't know about, for example, e-cigarettes. It's very likely that, if you're a daily user of these products, you are exposing your lungs to a chemical process that could be causing long-term damage. So I would certainly highlight that, because that seems to be what's happened. That in terms of a signal, that seems to be the strongest signal we have, is sort of exposing these chemicals to products that have never been approved for inhalation, day after day. It's likely going to be impairing their function. Now, what kind of disease is going to end up? That's still emerging, but we do have signals already, just from a few years, suggesting that it's going to be increasing every, for example, I talk about asthma, bronchitis in youth, or even more severe things in like COPD, for example, in adults. So I would point to that sort of thing and saying, listen, you're still taking this chemical, exposing and lung tissue is some of the most sensitive tissue we have in the body. Exposing that tissue to something like this, that's not been approved, that's not been studied, that's what I would emphasize.
Very good. And then we have two more questions. One is, what is the status of popcorn lung due to vaping?
Yes, the FDA actually, so popcorn lung, that chemical diacetyl, I think is what it is. I think it causes it. Yeah, it was found in the microwave popcorn among workers to basically cause severe lung injury in those workers. And so as some unscrupulous people were putting it into products, well, or maybe unknowingly, I don't know, with certain flavors, like cinnamon, for example. So basically exposing users to this chemical. The FDA actually did act on that. So they I can't remember what year it was, but I believe they did basically prohibit its use in vaping fluid. Now, how much is that being enforced? Again, judging by our current state of our market, I don't know. This products could be over. I've not seen any surveillance study looking to see if that product, how much of that still exists on the market.
Okay. Yeah, that was probably about 7, 8 years ago, 6, 7, 8 years ago. I think there was a lot of conversation about that. And so the last question here regarding EVALI, is EVALI a medical diagnosis or symptoms of other diagnosis? For example, is bronchiolitis or popcorn lung an EVALI diagnosis?
That's a good question. I'm not a medical doctor. I can't answer that. It's a syndrome, I know. So it's not a specific diagnosis. So it encompasses things. Like I said, people were showing up with lipid pneumonia. Some people had chemical burns. They all sort of were put under that EVALI syndrome rubric. So I don't know if popcorn lung fits under that per se.
Okay, and then one more question just popped in here. Do you have any charts or information about the short and long-term negative health effects of THC and CBD in vaping devices, which are typically referred to as Delta 8, Delta 9, Delta 10 vape pens, such as cake bars? So now we're kind of transitioning into that, the THC and CBD realm.
Unfortunately, I don't. I haven't done research in that area for a couple
Mm-hmm.
reasons. One is that the FDA, Center for Tobacco Product, has no authority whatsoever over those products. So they can't even study a nicotine and THC containing or CBD containing product combined. Once it has something else in it, that is out of their purview. So they won't fund any of that research. And so I haven't done any of the research in that. I'm not as familiar with it. I can't think of any offhand. You might want to look at the truthinitiative.org site. They have a lot of resources up there It's on this page I'm showing you, and that first hyperlink up there. See if it's there. They often have things for handouts.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, it's kind of a whole new world for THC and marijuana derivatives as well. So
You're
a
right,
lot of new things coming out.
and that's exactly it. And the research there is even further behind. So so when I talk about all these changes that have occurred just in the last few years, I can barely keep up myself as a tobacco researcher.
Yeah.
Those who are doing the sort of the marijuana research are even further behind, because so much of this is not being studied. The federal government still classifies those as illegal products. It's really hard to get funding for it. Only if it's very strict. I know people who do it at other places, not in Texas. And the DEA has to come inspect your facility all the time. I mean, it's very difficult, let's put it that way. So we're way behind. We don't know. What is vaping these products going to add an additional risk on top of vaping nicotine? We don't know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, that's all the questions that we have in the chat and in the Q&A. And in the chat box, I did put a link for folks who want and need the CEU credit for attending today's training or today's webinar. You can click on that link and please complete the short evaluation. Lady Jane has confirmed that we will be making the slides and the video recording available to attendees today. So you'll have this available. And so thank you very much, Dr. Robinson, for
Thank you.
taking the time to provide the information.
And my email is on the first slide. So if anyone has any questions, certainly feel free to email me.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and have a wonderful Thursday.
Thank you, Bryce. Thank you, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.